Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kiwoon wash processed Panama from Persimmon Coffee. And there's the bag right there. I'll go ahead and show you the back as well because they do handwrite all of the information on their bags, and I find that to be a very nice touch. Persimmon, based out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and they were a suggestion to us by our good buddy Zach. So shout outs to and thank you to Zach for the suggestion. And if you've never heard of this coffee roaster, then you're probably not alone, given that they might be the smallest coffee roaster we have ever reviewed on this channel. And they're also pretty new, having opened up just a couple of years ago. One really interesting thing about this coffee roaster is that they typically only carry one coffee on them at a time. And when they released this Panama, Zach was, of course, quick to notify me, given that he knows just how strong of a preference I have in terms of reviewing Panamanian coffees, especially non-Panamanian geishas, because they're so hard to find, and I love jumping on that opportunity to review those coffees. One quick thing I wanted to say before we start this review is I wanted to give a huge congratulations to Persimmon, given that they should be opening up their first ever coffee shop here pretty soon, and that's an exciting moment for any coffee business, but we're here to discuss this Panama, so this right here is day 27 of this coffee. All right, and recipe we settled on for this coffee was a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 199 degrees Fahrenheit, and I like this best through the AeroPress. Now, they list themselves as a more medium light for their roast profile. However, I would definitely consider this to be on the more developed side. So I'll say medium, but even then it's pushing it a little far. So we'll go with an American medium for the roast profile. With those things out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. So day 18, which was the first impression, and it does need to be noted because this is kind of important. It's not necessarily the best initial start to get a bag of coffee on day 17. So the first time I did receive this coffee, it was 17 days past its roast date, and given just how developed this coffee was, there was never going to be too much change from the first time I was trying this coffee until the end. The only sort of change that was ever going to come was from adjustments I made myself, so that wasn't necessarily the best first impression. But what else was really surprising about this coffee was just how developed it felt the first time I tried it. So Zach typically prefers lighter coffees in general, so that's why it was a little interesting given just how far along the development spectrum this coffee was. And I start off every coffee brewing at 205 degrees Fahrenheit, but just opening the bag, I knew that this one was going to be a little further than normal. And as a result, it kind of lent itself to this much more roasty cup, and it was quite smoky as well. Had a little bit of that caramelized aspect that I describe as typically the better side of medium coffees in general, so it wasn't off to the best start for all of those factors, but I knew, maybe some adjustments were going to make this coffee significantly better. Day 20, ran it through the V60 and immediately lowered the temperature, so typically I might take some more time to try it with those higher temperatures, but I kind of knew, given the roast profile of this coffee, we were going to need to lower it to kind of maybe reduce a lot of those more smoky aspects to this coffee. A little bit more of the caramel in the cup at the right temperatures. It also has this somewhat bright apple acidity to the coffee, which isn't also my favorite thing. Those are kind of characteristics that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of. Flavor notes they have listed on here: caramel, tangerine, and I want to say Honeycrisp. So an apple flavor note, I can see it, but it's all kind of buried underneath a little bit more developed of a profile. Day 22, much of the roastiness is toned down at those lower temperatures, so I definitely settled on going with lower temperatures for this coffee in general. Caramelized sweetness will likely be the most defining characteristic to this coffee. In addition to that, some more subtle florals, as it is still a Panamanian coffee. So at the more lower temperatures, when the coffee does cool down, I am able to get some slight Panamanian florals to this cup of coffee, which is one of the better aspects of things. Day 23, ran it through the automatic coffee maker, and much of the roastiness is ramped up in this brew method. So I can kind of tier these things. The most roastiness I was experiencing was through the automatic coffee maker, then through the Chemex, and then through the V60. So that's why I preferred the V60 initially before trying the AeroPress for this coffee. Underneath the really robust roastiness of this coffee was this kind of Panamanian cookie-like sweetness. So it's like a sugar cookie. It's like this vanilla sugar cookie that I taste with so many Panamanian coffees, especially the ones that aren't Panamanian geishas. And it's my favorite aspect. It's one of the reasons I'm a huge fan of Panamanian coffees that aren't Panamanian geishas as well. Has a fair bit of this kind of caramelized burnt sugar to it, so that's also a little bit of a detracting factor. But whenever I was able to get some more of that kind of floral cookie sweetness to this cup of coffee, that was the best aspect of it. Day 25, another day through the Chemex, and as kind of mentioned, it doesn't necessarily do overly well in the Chemex, as it does seem to bring out a fair bit of the roasty smokiness to this coffee. Can feel more of the smokiness than compared to the V60, as it's this dark chocolate that's really kind of dominating this brew method. So yeah, I wasn't a fan of the Chemex for this coffee, and day 26, the first time I tried it through the AeroPress with a more diluted recipe and a lower temperature, I was able to get some of the smokiness to even out a bit. So it wasn't quite as overbearing as it had been through other brew methods, and was feeling a little bit more of the citric sharpness in the cup, and it was still kind of dominated by the smoky chocolate, but it did have that kind of florality in the background, that slight cookie sweetness in the background, and a little bit more of it than previous brew methods. So that's why I settled on this being the best brew method. This is kind of the best result I could get from this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and 3 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. The finish, level 4, it has a very kind of old school coffee finish to it, as it definitely tastes a little bit more in the traditional coffee sense. And it does have a more robust body, especially given that by the end I had settled on the AeroPress as being our brew method for it. And then we have to look at that big level 4 right there, which is the smokiness. So that's the best I could do with this coffee. There were times, other brew methods, most specifically the automatic coffee maker, where I do kind of have to push that all the way up to a level 5 because it was quite smoky. As I kind of mentioned, this is definitely more developed, and the medium, yeah, it's even a little bit more so for medium in general. So the smokiness is quite high. And as a result, you have that caramelized aspect, which never ended up actually being as dominant as I necessarily would have expected. There's a fair bit of caramel to it, but even then it's at that level 3, slightly lower side of the level 3. Chocolate, was able to get a fair bit more of this dark chocolate aspect to it, but I also lumped the vanilla in there because that vanilla cookie sweetness that I was able to get from this coffee is also there. So level 3, but it's not really an overly sweet coffee, as that right there is at a level 2. Now the citrus, which is something I'm able to get a little bit more out of through this AeroPress, it's at a level 3. It's that tangerine that they mentioned, and of course we lump the apple into this category. So it's also on the slightly lower side of the level 3. Every other brew method, it's a level 2. It's not the most pronounced characteristic to this coffee. Neither is the slight Panamanian florality that I'm able to experience, and my favorite aspect, that kind of sugar cookie that I do experience. All of those things kind of toned down. The last major factor we must discuss is the cleanliness, which is at a level 2. And if I'm being generous, it could be on the higher side of level 2, lower side of level 3, but given just how much of the more developed characteristics I get in this cup of coffee, most specifically that smokiness that I keep kind of harping on, it would be really hard for me to push this above a level 2. So I feel like, for the most part, I really like the way that this tasting wheel looks, because I think this is the best I could get from this coffee, and this is probably the best representation of what I was experiencing from the best of this coffee. All right, my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, and I must start out with this because every single time I review a more developed coffee, I have to say this. Objectively, I don't necessarily feel that light coffees are better than medium coffees. So that must be said because I have reviewed some more developed coffees on this channel that I actually had some pretty positive things to say about. I think that if they're done really well, then I can enjoy what they are. However, with that being said, I think a lot of people know I'm very particular about Panamanian coffees in general because they are my favorite coffee. And having a more developed Panamanian coffee is never going to be a selling point to me because I see all the wonderful things that's in this coffee, and it's a little bit of a shame that I'm not able to get more out of them. I also have to admit, I'm not the best at reviewing these coffees in general, given that I don't review a whole lot of these coffees. It's typically just a couple a year max, if I even do any throughout the year. So I don't have a lot of expertise in kind of discussing maybe more developed coffees in general because they're typically just not my preference. So all of those things must be noted in this review. So as a result, yeah, this one's not necessarily my favorite. I had such high expectations for it, and the entire thing's a little unfortunate given that I really like the business and their business model, and I really want them to succeed. But I also understand that this one was definitely not my cup of coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, is somebody that does like a little bit more medium profiled coffee in general, because this one right here does have some nice characteristics to it, and if you can find a way to get those highlighted in a more pronounced capacity, most specifically that slight florality and a little bit more of that sugar cookie aspect, then I think that you might really enjoy this coffee, especially given that it does have a lot of those factors, some more traditionality, some higher body, and even that traditional coffee profile that comes from more developed coffees. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that though. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Persimmon, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kiwoon Wash Process Panama from Persimmon Coffee. Thank you for watching.